I was born into a house where silence spoke louder than kindness. My name is Aurora Kennedy, and by the time I was 10 years old, I already knew that love in our family came with conditions. We lived in a grand old home tucked in the quieter woods of Vermont with iron gates and polished hardwood floors where appearances meant everything and warmth was as rare as snow in July. My father, Richard, had been a military man all his life, a man of rules, orders, and expectations. My mother, Eleanor, carried the air of an old New England matriarch, elegant but emotionally distant, her lips forever pursed as if she were permanently unimpressed. My older sister, Scarlett, was the golden child. Everything she touched seemed to shine in my parents' eyes. She was brilliant, sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and mercilessly ambitious. By the time she was 15, she was already winning debate tournaments and getting invited to prestigious summer programs. I, on the other hand, loved quiet things, sketching, writing poetry, learning to carve small animals out of wood. My talents were softer, less measurable, and therefore invisible to my family. Richard would say, "Stop wasting your time with that nonsense, Aurora." Eleanor would sigh and tell me to try harder, be more like Scarlett. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt the weight of judgment crushing my voice. It wasn't always cruel, it was worse than that. It was dismissive. It made me feel like a ghost living among people who never really saw me. When I turned 16, I won a local arts scholarship. I remember walking into the dining room holding the certificate, heart pounding, with a rare flicker of pride. Richard didn't even look up from his newspaper. Eleanor raised an eyebrow and asked if it would help me get a real job. Scarlett smirked and said, "That's cute." The scholarship ended up in a drawer. My hope went with it. At 19, I packed my things into 2 bags and left. I didn't scream. I didn't slam the door. I just disappeared the same way they had always made me feel. I moved south to Rhode Island and began building a life with my own hands. I worked at a local crafts shop during the day and carved wooden ornaments at night. I met Elliot at a farmer's market. He was quiet, kind, and funny in a soft sort of way. A carpenter by trade, he understood wood better than people. We connected like 2 survivors finding each other in the wreckage. By 25, we were married and living in a small cottage just outside Providence. When I gave birth to our daughter Lana, I remember staring into her eyes and thinking, I will never make her feel invisible. Lana was my everything. Curious, bright, always asking questions. She was the kind of child who would pick up fallen leaves just to admire their patterns. Her laugh was the soundtrack of my mornings. I didn't care that we didn't have much money. We had joy. We had safety. And for a while, that was more than enough. But then Elliot died. A workplace accident, a fall that shattered more than bones. The grief was swift and consuming. Lana was only 8. She clung to me every night asking when Daddy was coming home. I didn't have answers. I only had tears. With Elliot gone and rent piling up, I had no choice but to consider the unthinkable, returning to the Kennedy estate, the place I had spent years trying to forget. It wasn't an easy decision. I stared at that phone for 3 days before calling Eleanor. Her voice was clipped as always. I told her I needed a place to stay for a few weeks while I found work. After a long pause, she said, "We have space." That was it. No condolences, no questions. Just space. Lana and I arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Scarlett opened the door with a look that told me she hadn't changed at all. "Well, well, the prodigal ghost returns," she said. Eleanor stood behind her, arms folded. Richard was in the study and didn't even come out to greet us. That night, as Lana unpacked her small suitcase, she looked up at me and asked, "Mommy, is this place safe?" I lied. I told her yes, but deep down, I could already feel the old chill returning. The house looked the same, polished, pristine, loveless. The next morning at breakfast, Scarlett's daughter had pancakes and strawberries. Lana got dry toast. I bit my tongue. I told myself to endure for Lana's sake just until I found work. But every day chipped away at me. Lana was asked to clear dishes she didn't use, scolded for playing too loudly given chores under the pretense of responsibility. One evening, I heard her crying in the bathroom. When I knocked, she said through tears, "I don't think they like me here." I wrapped my arms around her and promised it was temporary. But I could see it in her eyes. She was beginning to understand the cost of being born into a family that never wanted you to bloom. I told myself I could protect her. I told myself nothing worse would happen. I was wrong. So very wrong. And what happened next would tear open every old wound and then cut even deeper. The first sign that things were unraveling came quietly. It wasn't in the form of a scream or a slammed door, but in the way Lana began folding her pajamas with perfect corners, how she asked for permission to enter rooms that were supposed to be hers too. She had always been polite, but this was something else. This was fear disguised as manners. I tried to counterbalance it with extra stories at night, with long hugs in the hallway, with whispered reminders that she was loved. But the weight of this house pressed down on her shoulders like it once did on mine. Scarlett seemed to take pleasure in assigning small tasks to Lana, all under the guise of teaching responsibility. Eleanor remained elegantly silent, sipping her morning tea while watching everything unfold like it was a play she had no intention of interrupting. Richard barely acknowledged our existence unless it was to critique. One evening, I came home from a job interview, a rare opportunity at a gallery downtown, and found Lana wiping down the baseboards in the hallway. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and whispered, "Aunt Scarlett said I needed to do something useful if I wanted to stay." I clenched my fists and forced a smile, afraid that if I exploded now, I'd lose the only roof we had. That night, I applied to 5 more jobs. I told myself one more week, just one more. The day it happened was ordinary in the cruelest way. Lana had spent the morning coloring in the sunroom, a space Scarlett claimed for herself but never used. When I came back from running errands, Scarlett was already fuming. She stormed into the kitchen where Eleanor was arranging her bone china. "Your child broke my frame," she snapped. "What frame?" I asked, heart starting to race. "The one in the sunroom. The one with my law school photo. That thing is irreplaceable." I rushed to Lana, who stood frozen near the hallway, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I just tripped." Before I could say a word, Scarlett strode across the room and slapped Lana across the face. The sound echoed like thunder in my chest. Lana stumbled back, eyes wide with shock and pain, her cheek already glowing red. I screamed, "Don't you ever touch my daughter again!" Scarlett sneered. "Maybe if you'd raised her right, I wouldn't have to." I stepped between them, shaking. And then Richard appeared. He had heard the commotion and now stood in the doorway like a statue carved in ice. "What's going on?" he demanded. "She hit my daughter," I said. "She broke my frame," Scarlett barked. "And this thing you call a mother is teaching her to be a liability." Richard's face darkened. "Enough," he said coldly. Eleanor appeared behind him, her expression unreadable. I was trembling with rage, but before I could take Lana and leave, Richard moved forward. In one swift, brutal motion, he shoved me aside and reached for the cane he had leaned against the stair rail. He raised it high and brought it down across Lana's back. She screamed, not a childish whimper, but a sound I will never forget, raw, wounded, disbelieving. She crumpled to the floor, clutching her side. I dropped to my knees beside her, shielding her with my body. "You coward," I hissed. "You hit a child." Richard didn't speak. He just turned and walked away. Eleanor murmured something about overreacting. Scarlett smirked like she had won. My world stopped spinning. Something in me broke and reshaped all at once. The trauma of my childhood came rushing back, but this time it wasn't mine alone. They had crossed the final line. I scooped Lana into my arms. She was sobbing, her body trembling against mine. "We're leaving," I said. "We're never coming back." I didn't pack bags. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out that door with nothing but my daughter and the fire building inside me. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed bruising, no fractures. But what hurt more than the marks on her back was the look in her eyes. "Mommy," she asked quietly. Did I deserve that? I felt something inside me splinter. "No, baby, never." A nurse gave Lana a stuffed penguin while we waited for the discharge papers. I sat there thinking, this ends now. No more tolerance, no more quiet, no more pretending blood means loyalty. While Lana rested, a knock came at the hospital door. It was Dr. Caroline, the neighbor from across the estate. She looked solemn. "I saw what happened," she said softly. "I have footage," I gasped. "You recorded it. I was outside on my porch. The angle's not great, but the audio's clear." He hit her, and Scarlett admitted it. My knees buckled. "Will you testify?" Her eyes met mine. "I already called a friend of mine in child services, and if you press charges, I will stand beside you." My fingers shook as I gripped her hand. "Thank you." That night, as Lana slept beside me in the hospital cot, I opened my laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I typed. Word after word, sentence after sentence. I detailed everything: the abuse, the neglect, the control, the violence. I titled it, "My Daughter Was Hurt by Her Own Blood," and I hit publish. Then I called Daniel, and the war began. The moment Daniel picked up the phone, his voice calm and measured. As always, I knew I had made the right call. We hadn't spoken in years, not since we both dropped out of our law program for very different reasons. He had gone back later and finished. I hadn't. I had run toward survival while he had turned pain into purpose. Daniel specialized in family trauma and domestic abuse cases now. I barely got the words out before my voice cracked. I told him about Lana, about Scarlett's slap, about Richard's strike, about Caroline's recording. There was a pause. Then he said, "You did the right thing calling me. We'll file for child endangerment, assault, negligence, emotional abuse." I asked him if we even had a chance. He replied, "They think because you stayed silent, you'll always stay silent. That's their first mistake." I leaned back, the fluorescent lights of the hospital humming above me. Lana stirred in her sleep, whimpering softly. I stroked her hair and whispered, "We're not going to let them win." By morning, the post had spread farther than I imagined. My inbox flooded with messages. Some from strangers who had lived through similar pain, others from old classmates who remembered how quiet I used to be. A few were from extended family expressing disbelief or saying, "You should have kept this private." But there was no privacy left to protect. They had stripped that away the moment they touched my daughter. By the afternoon, Caroline's friend at Child Services had already sent a formal notice to the Kennedy household requesting a home welfare investigation. Eleanor responded with an email full of faux indignation. Scarlett left a voice message calling me unstable. Richard said nothing, which somehow felt louder than the rest. Daniel assembled a case file. He gathered the medical report from the ER photos of Lana's bruises, a psychological assessment from the hospital counselor, and Caroline's video. He requested Officer Malone, a local cop known for being direct and unflinching, to assist in formal interviews. That night, I wrote a second post this time, explaining why I had stayed quiet all those years and what changed. I ended it with, "They broke me, but they will not break her. Not again." It went viral. A Vermont advocacy group reached out offering resources and a spotlight. Lana and I were moved into a safe transitional apartment while legal proceedings began. I took unpaid leave from everything to focus solely on her healing and the case. I was done surviving. I was ready to fight. The first court session was scheduled just 2 weeks later. I walked into that building wearing a charcoal gray suit, hair tied tightly back, no makeup. Not to look good, to look like I had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Daniel walked beside me with his briefcase, calm and fierce, like a man who had done this 100 times and still cared. In the lobby, we passed reporters. I didn't look at the cameras. I wasn't here to make noise. I was here to finish a war. Scarlett arrived in a red blazer and sunglasses like she was walking into a brunch, not a courtroom. Eleanor wore her pearls and carried herself with icy disdain. Richard came in with his lawyer and no expression. The same face he used to wear when I brought him tea as a child and hoped he'd say thank you. Lana stayed home with a counselor from the Advocacy Center, someone trained to handle children recovering from trauma. I kissed her forehead before I left and told her this was for her, that we were building something new, something better. She smiled faintly and handed me her stuffed penguin. "For luck," she said. The hearing began. Daniel opened with the facts. A minor child was assaulted in her grandfather's home. The assault was recorded. A witness was prepared to testify. Medical evidence confirmed physical trauma. Psychological assessments indicated emotional harm. And all of it occurred under the watch of not one but 3 adults who either encouraged, committed, or enabled the abuse. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Honorable June Myers, listened with a stern face and eyes that missed nothing. Caroline testified first. Her voice was steady. She described what she saw and played the audio. The courtroom was silent when Scarlett's voice was heard screaming at Lana, followed by a harsh slap. Then came Richard's footsteps, Eleanor's cold reply, the muffled cry. Caroline's voice cracked only once when she said I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined they'd hurt her like that. Then came the ER nurse who treated Lana. She described the location of the bruises the way Lana had flinched every time someone moved too quickly. She said the child asked repeatedly for her mother and only calmed when Aurora entered the room. The judge took notes. The defense faltered. Scarlett claimed she had lost her temper but didn't mean harm. Eleanor denied knowledge. Richard's lawyer attempted to discredit the video due to the angle, but Judge Myers shut that down immediately. When Daniel stood again, he read a written statement from Lana dictated with the help of her counselor. It said, "I didn't mean to break anything. I just tripped. When Aunt Scarlett hit me, I was scared. When Grandpa hit me, I thought I was going to die. I don't want to go back. Ever." There wasn't a single dry eye in the gallery. Even the court clerk wiped her cheek. The judge recessed for deliberation. I sat motionless, gripping the stuffed penguin like it was my own lifeline. Daniel placed a steady hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You did it. But it didn't feel like winning? Not yet." When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Myers read her decision with a voice that shook the walls. "Richard Kennedy, the court finds you guilty of aggravated assault against a minor. You are hereby sentenced to 9 months in prison and prohibited from contacting the child directly or indirectly for 10 years. Scarlett Kennedy, you are sentenced to 6 months of supervised community service and mandated to attend anger management and child welfare education courses. You are restricted from unsupervised contact with any child for the next 5 years. Eleanor Kennedy, though not the aggressor, your failure to act and history of enabling abuse warrants legal consequence. You are fined $10,000 and restricted from contact with the child for 5 years." I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just breathed. For the first time in years, I breathed. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, questions flew, but I walked straight past them. Daniel followed quiet and protective. In the parking lot, I looked up at the sky. It was gray and wide and still. I whispered, "It's over." But it wasn't. Not completely. There was more to rebuild. There always is after a war. But now I knew I could. Because I had won the first battle that mattered most. I had protected my daughter. I had broken the cycle. And I was just getting started. In the weeks following the verdict, the silence in our lives felt different. It wasn't the heavy silence I'd grown up with in the Kennedy house where every quiet moment was filled with judgment and unsaid expectations. This was the silence of peace, of safety, of space to heal. Lana and I moved into a small rental home just outside of Burlington. It wasn't fancy, but it had wide windows, warm lighting, and a little patch of backyard where Lana could plant whatever flowers she wanted. I let her choose the curtains for her new room. She picked ones with stars and moons. She said she wanted to dream of the sky again. She hadn't had nightmares in 2 weeks, and I took that as a miracle. I turned the second bedroom into a small studio, placing my carving tools on shelves, arranging paints and sketchbooks beside a window that faced the street. For the first time in years, I wanted to create again. But more than anything, I wanted to give Lana a life where she could feel safe in her own skin. We spent mornings drawing together and afternoons baking banana bread or walking down to the nearby park. Every time she laughed, it felt like a piece of me came back to life. One morning, while packing her lunch, I found a note she had written on the back of a grocery list. It said, "My mom is my superhero." I pressed it to my chest and cried, not out of pain, out of pride. One afternoon, as we planted small yellow flowers along the fence, Lana looked up and asked Mommy, "Do you think families can be made, not just born?" I looked at her, dirt on her cheeks, hope in her eyes. "I think the best ones are," I said. She smiled and returned to digging. In the background, the wind chimes we hung together rattled softly in the breeze. Meanwhile, the internet had not forgotten. My original posts continued to circulate. One morning, I received an email from a producer of a national podcast focused on stories of survival and justice. They asked if I would be willing to share our story in a live recorded segment. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to disappear from the spotlight and focus solely on Lana, but another part of me knew that silence was what had protected them for too long. I agreed. The interview was raw and honest. I told them about my childhood, about the Kennedy name, and what it cost me. I told them about Scarlett's slap and Richard's cane, about Eleanor's eyes that always looked past me. But most of all, I told them about Lana, about the moment she whispered, "Did I deserve it?" and how that question changed everything. The episode aired within a week and reached over 1 million listeners. Messages flooded in, some from survivors, others from young women trying to leave their own dangerous homes. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Isabel who ran a nonprofit called Break the Cycle. She said they helped survivors of family abuse transition into new lives and advocated for systemic change in how abuse is reported and addressed. She invited me to speak at a local summit in Boston. I said yes. Lana and I boarded a train with our overnight bags, and as we rode past forests and fields, I watched her lean her head on the window, her stuffed penguin in her lap. The summit was held in a renovated library with high ceilings and quiet corners. When it was my turn to speak, I stood behind the podium with Lana sitting in the front row. I began by saying I used to believe family was something you had to accept no matter the cost. But then they hurt my daughter. And suddenly, I remembered I get to choose. The room was still. At the end, people stood. Some clapped, others cried. Lana ran up to me and hugged my waist. "You were amazing," she said. I kissed her forehead. "You're the reason I can be." The event sparked more interviews. I was asked to consult on school programs about identifying early signs of abuse. I helped write a small children's book based on Lana's experience, gently told with illustrations of stars and flowers. We called it The House We Chose. One day I received an email from a literary agent who had read my original posts and heard me speak. She asked if I'd ever considered turning our story into a memoir. I laughed at first. Me, a memoir. But then I thought about how many Auroras were out there, how many Lanas were silently enduring, and I said yes. I titled it The Family I Built. Writing it was like surgery, painful, precise, necessary. I revisited every memory with sharp clarity, but I didn't write it from a place of vengeance. I wrote it from the steady hand of a woman who had survived and now stood tall. When the book was published, it didn't hit bestseller lists, but it reached the people it needed to. A teacher in Montana emailed to say she used it in a curriculum. A mother in Oregon said it helped her leave her abusive husband. A teenage girl in Michigan said it saved her life. That was all the success I needed. One evening, while watching Lana paint at the kitchen table, I received a phone call. It was Caroline. She said, "I just wanted you to know I sold my house. I'm moving to Arizona to be closer to my daughter. But I'll never forget what you taught me." I smiled and thanked her. After the call, Lana looked at me and said, "Is she the lady who helped us?" I nodded. "She saved us, didn't she?" "You both did," I said. Together. As the months passed, the nightmares became less frequent, the laughter louder. The shadows of the Kennedy house faded into something distant and dull. They no longer had power. They were history. We were future. One night, Lana climbed into bed beside me, curling up with her penguin. She whispered, "Mommy, thank you for choosing me." I wrapped my arms around her and whispered back, "I'll choose you every day, no matter what." And in that quiet moment, with the hum of the night around us, I realized something. I hadn't just saved her. She had saved me, too. The seasons shifted slowly, and with them, so did our lives. By the time spring gave way to summer, the garden Lana and I had planted was in full bloom. Daffodils lined the walkway, marigolds reached for sunlight, and tiny blue forget-me-nots peeked from under the hedges. Each flower felt like a small victory, a quiet symbol of the beauty we could grow from the ruins. I had never known what healing really meant until I watched Lana skip barefoot through the backyard, humming to herself, her hair blowing in the wind. No fear in her eyes. The bruises had long faded, but the strength in her step reminded me that scars don't always weaken us. Sometimes they forge us. One morning, over breakfast, as she carefully peeled the crust off her toast, she said, "Mommy, do you ever think about them? About who they were?" I hesitated, sipping my coffee slowly. "I used to, but not anymore." She tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because they don't get to live in my mind for free," I said. Lana smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. That afternoon, I received a call from Isabel at Break the Cycle. She said the organization was launching a new campaign focused on intergenerational trauma and asked if I would be the keynote speaker for their regional conference. I paused. I had shared our story in podcasts, interviews, articles, but this, standing on a stage again in front of hundreds, speaking the truth without notes or edits, that would be something else. Then I heard Lana laughing in the background, and I said yes. The day of the conference arrived with nervous energy. I wore a simple navy dress one Lana picked out and tied my hair in a loose braid. She kissed my hand before I walked onto the stage. "You've got this," she whispered. The lights were warm, the audience silent. I took a breath and began. I was born into a house that taught me silence. That love was earned. That obedience was the only currency. But then I had a daughter, and when they laid hands on her, I remembered what it meant to have a voice. I paused, letting the weight settle. I used to think surviving meant keeping your head down and staying quiet. But I've learned that surviving is not enough. Thriving means standing tall. It means choosing your own name, your own family, your own worth. When I finished, the standing ovation felt like a thunderstorm of validation. People lined up to hug me, thank me, share their own stories. Some cried, others just squeezed my hand. One woman, barely older than Lana, whispered, "You saved my future." That night, I held Lana close and told her what they said. She beamed with pride. "We make a good team," she said. And we did. In the following months, my memoir gained more attention. Not fame, not money, but impact. I was invited to collaborate on a series of school workshops about emotional abuse and the subtle signs children often hide. One school counselor in New Jersey told me a 10-year-old had come forward after reading our children's book, saying her uncle hit her too. It made me cry, not from sorrow, from knowing that maybe, just maybe, all the pain we endured had been turned into something that could protect someone else. Scarlett, Richard, and Eleanor had all faded from our lives. Scarlett tried once to reach out through a lawyer threatening defamation, but Daniel responded with the legal equivalent of, "Try me." We never heard from her again. Richard completed his sentence and reportedly moved to a veterans facility out of state. Eleanor sold the family home and relocated somewhere in Maine, far from the echo of her once pristine estate. I didn't feel satisfaction at their downfall. What I felt was freedom. True, untethered freedom. Our lives no longer revolved around avoidance or survival. We had built a new center, quiet, strong, joyful. One Sunday, Lana and I decided to repaint the living room. We chose a soft sea glass green. Halfway through, we got into a paint fight, laughing as we smeared color across each other's cheeks. Later, covered in smudges, we lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. Mommy Lana whispered, "You know what I realized today?" "What, sweetheart?" She smiled. "I don't think I'm scared anymore, not even of loud voices." I turned to her and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That's because you're the bravest person I know." She thought for a second. "And you're the strongest." We stayed like that side by side until the sunlight dimmed into twilight. A few weeks later, her school asked me to speak at a parent-student assembly about resilience. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable, but when I asked, she said, "I want them to know who you are, and who I am because of you." On the day of the event, she stood next to me on stage. I spoke briefly, then stepped aside. Lana took the mic and said, "My mom taught me that love means safety, that being scared doesn't mean you're weak, and that leaving something behind isn't giving up, it's choosing better." The crowd was silent, then applauded louder than I expected. I held back tears as we walked off stage hand in hand. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she turned to me and said, "Mommy, I think we saved each other." I kissed her forehead, every single day. And in the quiet hum of the night, I realized we hadn't just escaped something terrible. We had rewritten what it meant to be a family, not by name, not by blood, but by choice. By love, by fire, forged into strength. Summer turned to fall, and the leaves outside our window shifted from green to gold as if the earth itself were exhaling a long-held breath. Lana started middle school that September, wearing a mint-colored backpack and the small silver pendant I had given her the night before, engraved with the word "Brave." I watched her walk through the school gates with her head high and her steps sure. She didn't turn back to look at me, and that small act of confidence made my heart swell. I spent the morning sitting in our sunroom, the soft light pouring in as I traced patterns into the wood of a new carving. It was a penguin, small and smooth, just like the one she used to hold during the worst of our nights. I thought about how far we'd come. Thought about how I used to flinch at every unknown number that called my phone, afraid it would be someone from my past trying to drag me back into the shadows. But now the only calls I feared missing were the ones from her school, telling me about her art awards, her science fair projects, or how she helped another kid who was crying in the hallway. One evening in late October, as the wind began to bite a little sharper and we wrapped ourselves in blankets on the couch, Lana looked at me and said, "Mommy, do you think people like Grandpa and Aunt Scarlett know what they did? Do they care?" I sat still, letting her words hang between us. I think people like that convince themselves they didn't do anything wrong, because if they admitted it, they'd have to change. And that's harder than lying to yourself. She nodded slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. But I'm glad we're not like them. Me too, I said, and pulled her into my arms. A week later, I received an invitation to speak at a university panel on the psychology of family estrangement. The other panelists included therapists, professors, and one best-selling author. I felt small, almost out of place, but Lana stood behind me as I read the email and whispered, "Say yes. You belong there." So I did. The panel was held in a wood-paneled auditorium filled with students, faculty, and survivors of emotional abuse. I spoke about the insidious nature of generational control, how it's rarely about screaming matches and more about silence that molds your identity until you forget who you were before they broke you. I spoke about what it meant to be told you're unworthy by the people who raised you and what it meant to finally reject that lie. One professor approached me afterward and said, "You've given voice to something so many people live through but never name." That night, I received dozens of messages, one of which was from a woman who had been estranged from her parents for 15 years. She wrote, "I didn't know I was allowed to feel peace about that choice until now. Thank you." That was the moment I realized that what we had survived was not just a personal war, it was part of a collective story, too often buried in shame. And I wasn't done telling it. I began writing more essays, articles. I was invited to write a monthly column for a digital journal on trauma recovery. I titled the column Roots and Wings. Each piece explored a theme belonging self-worth identity after abandonment. Lana would read them all before I submitted them, circling her favorite lines in pencil and writing little notes like "powerful" or "say this louder." We created a routine. Fridays were our writing and cocoa nights. I would type while she read or sketched beside me, the soft hum of jazz music filling the kitchen. On one of those nights, she asked if she could write something too. I smiled and handed her a fresh notebook. She titled the first page, "The Day I Learned to Choose Myself." I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I just kissed her forehead and said, "That title already tells me everything." We spent the winter nested in comfort. I baked more. She painted more. We went on weekend road trips just to explore towns we'd never seen. In one of them, we stumbled across a secondhand bookstore where Lana found a collection of women's speeches. She opened to a random page and read aloud, "Our silence will not protect us." She looked up at me. "This one reminds me of you." Spring returned again, and with it the anniversary of the day we left the Kennedy house. We didn't speak of it in sorrow, but in gratitude. We marked the day, not with bitterness, but with ritual. We planted a tree in the yard, an oak this time. Strong, stubborn, steadfast. As we buried the roots into the earth, Lana said, "This is us, growing no matter what." I smiled, placing the final scoop of soil over the roots. Yes, no matter what. I knew then that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about standing beside it, acknowledging its presence, and choosing to live fully anyway. We weren't survivors anymore. We were builders, creators, women with our hands in the soil and our eyes on the horizon. And no matter who tried to silence us in the past, we had found a voice that no one could steal again. One bright morning in June, as sunlight poured through the kitchen windows and the scent of cinnamon toast filled the air, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, and when I unfolded the single sheet inside, I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Eleanor's. The note was short, carefully worded, almost clinical. She wrote that she had sold the estate that Richard had passed away quietly in his sleep at a veterans facility, and that Scarlett had moved to California and had no interest in contacting anyone again. The final sentence read, "I hope you have found peace in the choices you've made." I folded the letter slowly and slid it into a drawer without replying. I had nothing left to say to a woman who had stood by and watched her granddaughter be hurt and had done nothing. Later that afternoon, as Lana and I sat under the oak tree we had planted, I told her about the letter. She looked up from her sketchpad and asked, "Do you feel anything?" I thought for a moment and said, "I feel free." She smiled and returned to her drawing. A week later, I received an email from a national magazine asking to feature our story in a special edition focused on redefining family. I agreed on one condition: that they interview Lana too. They flew out a journalist and a photographer. The photo shoot took place in our backyard with the oak tree in the background and the sun casting a soft glow across the garden. Lana wore a pale yellow dress and held the original wooden penguin I had carved for her. I sat beside her, our hands clasped. During the interview, they asked her what family meant to her. She paused, then said, "Family is who makes you feel safe. It's not about names or blood. It's about love you can trust." When the article was published, it included that quote as the headline. The response was overwhelming. Letters arrived from across the country. Survivors, parents, children, people who had walked away from families that hurt them and built something better. One letter, written in trembling cursive, simply read, "Thank you for reminding me that I don't have to stay where I'm not loved." Lana and I read every message. We kept them in a wooden box we called the Hope Chest. Every time we felt the old doubts creep in, we'd read a few lines and remember why we chose the path we did. That summer, we were invited to speak at a youth summit organized by Break the Cycle. It was the largest crowd yet, over 1,000 teens and young adults, many of whom were navigating their own complex relationships with family. Lana took the stage first. She stood tall, holding the microphone with both hands, and said, "I used to think I had to be perfect to be loved. But then I learned that real love doesn't hurt you. It heals you." The applause was long and thunderous. I followed her and spoke about legacy, about breaking patterns, about being brave enough to walk away from what breaks you, even if it shares your name. When we stepped off the stage, several girls ran up to Lana, hugging her, thanking her. One boy whispered, "You're the reason I'm going to tell someone tonight." We sat in the hallway afterward, sipping bottled water, exhausted and glowing. Lana leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I think we're making a difference." I wrapped my arm around her. "You are the difference." As fall approached again, I was contacted by a major publishing house. They wanted to re-release my memoir with expanded chapters and a foreword written by a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. I spent weeks rewriting, revisiting old memories and new lessons. Lana wrote a small chapter at the end titled "What I Know Now." In it, she said I learned that being strong doesn't mean staying. Sometimes it means leaving even when you're scared, especially when you're scared. The new edition hit shelves in October. Bookstores hosted readings. One local shop created a window display of our story, complete with a replica of the oak tree. During one reading, a woman stood up in the back and said through tears, "I left my parents' house last week. I didn't think I could do it until I read your book." I cried in that moment not just for her, but for the version of me who once thought silence was safety. That night, Lana and I sat on the porch watching the stars. She looked up at the sky and asked, "Do you think some people are born to be loud so others can find their way in the dark?" I smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just tired of being quiet." She nodded. "Either way, we're not going back." "No," I said. "We never will." In that stillness with the moon high and the world quiet around us, I felt something I hadn't in years, peace that didn't come with guilt. It came with strength. We had chosen each other. We had chosen healing. We had chosen a life that wasn't perfect but was honest and full and entirely ours. And that was more than enough. The second anniversary of the day we left the Kennedy estate arrived quietly without fanfare, but with meaning stitched into every moment. Lana and I spent it the same way we did the year before, by planting something new. This time it was lavender, her favorite, the scent soft and calming, a symbol of all the gentleness we had reclaimed. As we pressed the roots into the earth, she said, "I don't remember the sound of their voices anymore." I paused, my fingers still in the soil. "That's not a bad thing," I replied. "It means they've stopped echoing." She nodded and smiled, sunlight catching the edge of her hair. That evening, as the sky turned dusky and fireflies blinked along the fence line, I sat at my desk finishing the last lines of a speech I was scheduled to give at a conference for trauma-informed educators. The keynote theme was reimagining safety. I had rewritten it twice already, but the final lines always stayed the same. We don't owe loyalty to pain. We owe protection to the child still living inside us and the children we raise after. Just as I saved her, she saved me. The next day, as I stood before a room of teachers, social workers, and school counselors, I told our story again. I watched their faces shift, some angry, some tearful, many silently nodding because they had seen versions of our pain in their classrooms. At the end, one teacher raised her hand and said, "If you could go back and change anything, would you?" I looked down for a moment, then answered, "I would have left sooner. I would have stopped trying to be good enough for people who didn't believe in kindness." But the journey taught me who I am, and more importantly, who I am not. And that's something no one can take from me. When I walked off the stage, I saw Lana standing near the exit, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. "You looked like fire up there," she said. I laughed, pulling her into a hug. "You looked like my reason." That weekend, we hosted a small backyard gathering with a few close friends, people we had collected over the last 2 years who had become more family than anyone tied to us by blood. There was music, laughter, food that tasted like comfort, and stories shared under the stars. One friend brought her teenage son who sat quietly beside Lana for most of the night. Later, he told his mother it was the first time he felt like he wasn't the only kid who had been let down by adults. That simple truth reminded me why we kept telling the story, not to reopen wounds, but to show others that healing was possible, and that silence didn't have to be the final chapter. As the fire pit crackled and Lana roasted her third marshmallow, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" I stared into the flames. Maybe. Life is strange like that. But if we do, it won't change anything. They don't have power anymore. She nodded and placed the marshmallow gently onto a graham cracker. "Then we'll just keep walking." We watched the flames dance, and I thought about how many nights I used to dream of escaping that house, of running down its long driveway and never looking back. Now I didn't dream of running. I dreamed of building, of staying, of belonging. Not to them, but to this life we had carved out with steady hands and fierce hearts. A few days later, I was asked to guest lecture at a university course titled The Psychology of Family Systems. The professor told me my story had been used in class discussions for over a year. I stood at the front of the lecture hall, looking out at students who had read my words and now heard my voice. I spoke about shame, about how it wraps itself around you like a second skin until you forget it doesn't belong to you. I told them about Lana's question, the one she asked after the first time she was hurt. Did I deserve it? And how the only thing more powerful than my rage was my answer. No. Never. Afterward, a student approached me and said I grew up believing pain was proof of love. Your story helped me see the lie in that. I thanked her and walked out into the afternoon light, the sun warm on my skin. That night, I tucked Lana in and sat beside her as she read aloud from a book of poems we'd found at a used bookstore. She paused at one and said, "This one feels like us." It read, "We came from broken roots, but still, we bloom." She traced the words with her finger, then looked at me. "We're more than what we escaped. We're what we became." I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "And what we chose," I added. The next morning, as I opened my laptop to answer emails, I saw one from a publishing house in the UK. They wanted to translate my memoir into 3 languages and include it in an educational toolkit for abuse recovery. I smiled, thinking of how far that voice had traveled from the quiet corners of a cold childhood home to classrooms and communities halfway around the world. Later that day, Lana handed me a new sketch. It was of two trees, one gnarled and leafless, the other tall and full of blossoms. Between them was a small bridge made of hands. I asked her what it meant. She said, "It's the bridge we built, from what hurt us to what we needed." And as I held that drawing in my hands, I realized the final truth that had been forming all along. I wasn't just a survivor or a mother or a woman who found her voice. I was an architect of something better. I had built a life with truth as the foundation, with love as the structure, and with my daughter's laughter as the roof that held everything together. And no matter what had come before this was the family we chose, the family we deserved, the family we would protect fiercely always.